Death Rides the Night by Peter Field, a Pat Stevens novel. Chapter 1. Something was worrying big one-eyed Ezra. This was quite evident to Pat and Sally Stevens as the evening meal progressed. Pat had butchered a fat 2-year-old steer that afternoon, and Sally had a huge pot of son of a gun for supper. Son of a gun is a rich and savory stew consisting of the heart, liver and kidney and sweet bread and marrow gut of the freshly butchered beef, quite popular throughout the West, though where it got its curious name no one knows. It was one of Ezra's favorite dishes, and he always looked forward to a butchering on account of a pot of son of a gun that was sure to grace the supper table that night. But tonight he didn't seem very interested in food. He didn't even seem to realize that he was eating his favorite dish. Sally had a huge iron pot of the stew on the kitchen range, and she was ditching up some deep bowls for each of the men at the table before calling them to supper. There were 3 cowhands beside Ezra at the Lazy Mare Ranch who ate at the table with Pat and Sally Stevens and their son Doc. The way the 3 hands and Doc dug into their bowls of stew convinced Sally that it tasted all right, but Ezra was just dallying with his. This was so unlike him that it was convincing proof that he was badly worried. Mighty bad worried, because Ezra wasn't the sort to let any little worries keep him from enjoying his food. He had a huge body with the strength of a bull on his vast shoulders, and he generally ate enough for 3 ordinary men. Sally had big flaky biscuits to go with the stew and a platter of fried potatoes. When Ezra took only 1 spoonful of potatoes and then began searching around in his bowls for pieces of heart, opposed to sopping his biscuit in it and gulping it down wholesale, Sally knew that something was radically wrong. She glanced at Pat, who sat at the head of the table, and saw that Pat was also regarding Ezra with some concern. She lifted her eyebrows when Pat turned in her direction, and he shook his head soberly to indicate he didn't know what was the matter. The other men and Doc were busy filling their stomachs and didn't seem to notice that anything was amiss.
"Is everything all right, Ezra?"
Sally asked anxiously across the table.
"I put in 2 cloves of garlic particularly because I know you like it that way."
Ezra looked at her with his one eye and said, What's that, ma'am?" His broad, scared face was blank with incomprehension.
"Didn't you hear me?"
Sally asked. I was thinking, ma'am." "Well, when Ezra's got a thought on his mind, there ain't much room for anything else," Pat said with a grin. "You know that, Sally, and just go let him eat his supper." "Sure is good son of a gun," muttered Ezra. He bent his red head to search in his bowl for another tidbit of heart and munched on it delicately. Sally turned a worried glance to her husband. She asked in a low, shocked voice,
"Do you suppose he's in love, Pat?"
Pat shook his head to indicate that this wasn't the time to badger the big man. He and Ezra had been close friends for a good many years, so close they generally understood each other's thoughts with unspoken words. There had been 3 of them those years before when Sam Sloane made up the trio, but many things had happened to separate the 3 and drive them apart. First, Pat had married Sally and settled here on the Lazy Mare Ranch in Powder Valley, and Sam and Ezra had settled on a ranch of their own in the lower part of the valley. This had been an ideal arrangement for a time, but both men were restless after the roving life they had lived before Pat's marriage, and it wasn't long before they sold off the ranch and went off on an adventure of their own to Corpse's Corner, from which Pat had evidently had to exonerate them. Returning to Powder Valley after that episode, Sam Sloane fell hopelessly in love with pretty Katie Lane, and after they were married, Sam settled down to ride a leg of the new Pony Express route into Dutch Springs, and Ezra was finally gravitating towards Lazy Mare Ranch to act as a foreman for Pat, whose duties as sheriff prevented him from overseeing the ranch quite close. But Pat had known all along that Ezra wasn't happy in this arrangement, and he had been trying to help the big one-eyed man acquire a ranch of his own so he wouldn't have to live with either of his married friends. Pat knew that the marriage of himself and of Sam had basically been at the bottom of Ezra's uneasy. It was because he felt himself to be alone and a misfit. It wasn't so much that Ezra actually hungered for a wife or a home of his own. Ezra had given up such hopes long ago. With his ugly scarred face and single eye, he knew that no woman could ever love him. But just the same, it wasn't easy for him to be around either Pat or Sam and see the happiness in which an accident of nature had denied him. Pat understood this feeling of Ezra's without it being put into words, and that's why he had been quietly doing everything in his power to help Ezra get situated on a place of his own. Just lately they had found a suitable place for sale, and a month previously Ezra had bought it with the aid of a loan from Pat. At the time, Pat thought the problem of Ezra's unhappiness was solved. He had been very cheerful this last month, buying cattle to stock the new ranch, putting the buildings and fences into repair, and getting ready to move in and take possession. That's why this sudden reoccurrence of Ezra's gloomy mood worried Pat. For a month he had been cheerful and happy, like his old self, and Pat was afraid something had gone wrong at the ranch to cause this relapse that left him with no appetite for Sally's delicious supper of son of a gun. Pat Stevens scraped the bottom of his own bowl loudly, and when Sally jumped up to take it to the kitchen for a refill, he rubbed his bulging stomach and told her, "Well, maybe only half full, honey. Then I'll finish up with some biscuits and jelly." When she went to the kitchen, he asked Ezra casually, "Is everything going all right out there at the ranch?" "Oh, you bet." Ezra took a sip of coffee and set his cup down. "I'll be getting out of your way and moving in next week, I reckon." "You know you're not in our way," Pat told him sharply. "It's been mighty fine having you here, helping keep things going right." Ezra was staring fixingly at the red and white checkered tablecloth, and with a huge finger, he traced a line around one of the red squares. "I run into Eustace Arlo in Dutch Springs today." Pat chuckled softly. "Is Harlow still sore because you got the jump on him and snapped up the Spanger Ranch before he had a chout and stout bid you?"
"He hadn't any right to be angry about that," said Sally briskly as she brought Pat's bowl back from the kitchen. "Just because he got all the money in the world isn't any reason why he should own all of Powder Valley. How about you, Doc? You ready for more stew?"
Doc replied,
"Not now, Mom." He looked up with a frown on his young face. "Can I go to the meeting with you tonight, Dad?"
Pat dipped into his fresh bowl of stew and asked, "What meeting?" "No," said Ezra loudly. "I don't reckon Mr. Arlo carries a mad very long. I bought him a drink in town today and offered me the loan of some of his boys if I needed help getting things started."
"Well, I think that's very nice of him," said Sally approvingly as she reseated herself. "I guess it isn't his fault he's as rich as Croas and doesn't know what to do with his money except buy up ranches." "Who's Croas, Mom?" Doc asked curiously. "He was an old king who had all the money in the world." "Gee whiz, I never heard of him."
"Oh, don't forget your mother used to be a school teacher," Pat chuckled. "What meeting were you talking about, son?" "I sure wouldn't trust him too far, though," Ezra put in darkly. "Had a couple of men with him today that looked like Texas gun hands to me. Ain't no need for him to be hiring strange hands when they got cowpokes here in the valley looking for jobs." Pat turned back to Ezra with a frown. "Meaning Eustace Arlo?" "Sure, that's who we was talking about, weren't we?" "Well, along with some history about kings and meetings, I don't know anything what's going on," Pat conceded dryly. So Harlow's bringing in gun hands from down Texas way, is he?
Sure enough looks that way. Folks say he's got so many hands hired now that they ride herd on each other, lacking cattle to herd on.
Ezra laughed loudly at his own joke and pushed his bowl back with him less than half emptied. He rubbed the back of a huge hand across his wet, red, whiskered face and pushed back his chair to get up.
Goodness, said Sally sharply. Aren't you even going to eat your dessert, Ezra? I opened a gallon of peaches today and made a deep pie.
Well, I reckon I just ain't got the appetite tonight, Ezra rumbled, avoiding her troubled gaze. Thought I might saddle up and ride into town and see what's going on.
Are you going to the meeting, Ezra? Doc called out excitedly. Maybe Mom will let me ride in with you.
Ezra replied,
I don't know what you're talking about,
and stalked out. Pat stared after him and shook his head dubiously. Well, he's mighty upset about something. He turned to the 3 cowhands still at the table. You boys know anything that's gone sour with Ezra? They all shook their heads and muttered that they didn't know. They hurried self-consciously and finished up their dessert and pushed back their chairs to leave as though to avoid further questioning.
Can I, Mom? Doc asked. Can you what, son? Ride into the meeting with Ezra. What meeting is he talking about, Pat?
I don't know. How are you, Pete? Pat called out to the last of the departing cowboys. Do you know anything of a meeting in town tonight? Pete was on his way through the door. He paused long enough to shake his head and mutter some sort of denial, then went on out towards the bunkhouse. Sally looked at Pat in consternation, with her pretty blonde head tilted sideways with a spot of color glowing in each cheek.
What's gotten into them all tonight, Pat? They all act as though they're afraid to talk to you.
Or ashamed, Pat said harshly.
And Ezra, when he doesn't even want to eat peach pie, there's something terribly wrong with him. Why, you might have thought we had scarlet fever or something.
Pat's lean bronze face was set in lines of harsh questioning. He shook his head and said, I don't know, Sally. Seems to me like something's up. He frowned down the table towards Doc. This meeting that you're talking about, son, where'd you hear about it?
I don't know. Some of the fellers were talking.
What sort of meeting is it?
Whole county, I reckon. Gee, I thought everyone was going.
Tonight?
Yeah, sure. I bet you Ezra and Pete and them are going. Can I ride in with them, Mum? Wait a minute, Doc.
She tightened her lips and looked at her husband.
You're still the sheriff, aren't you?
As far as I know, Pat grinned, but without humor. There ain't much been sheriffing doing lately.
Isn't it kind of queer that you haven't been notified of the meeting? That they wouldn't have one without you, would they?
Pat's face was grim. It frightened Sally suddenly. Most of the time she could forget those old gunfighting days when the sort of look on Pat's face caused her heart to jump in her throat, because she knew it meant that he was ready to buckle on his guns and go out to meet death on even terms. He hadn't worn that look during much those last few years, but it still had the power to turn Sally's heart up into her throat. She leaned across the table and put her hand over his.
I'm sure everything's all right.
But her tone betrayed her. It said instead that she knew everything decidedly wasn't all right, and it changed to a pleading tone.
Don't get upset, Pat. Someone must have forgotten to notify you.
Pat Stevens looked past her towards the open door. He didn't appear to feel her hand on his, nor to note the pleading in her voice, and he said curtly, Well, I reckon I'd best go find out what it means. He got up and stalked out the front door. She sat very still at the table and listened to the hard crunch of his boot heels fading away to silence as he walked towards the corral.
Gee whiz, Doc said in a low tone of awe. Dad looked awful mad, didn't he, Mom? I'd sure hate to go up against him when he looked like that.
To Doc's utter astonishment, her mother put her face down in her hands on the table and began to cry. Great, racking sobs shook her slender shoulders, and Doc's eyes became red and big, and he stared at her with a moment of consternation. And then he got up and went to her and put his thin arm about her shoulders and his young face down against her hair and whispered,
Gee, Ma, don't do that. You know there won't be nothing happening to Dad. Why, I bet he could whip the whole Powder Valley single-handed if he was a mind to.
Sally's sobbing subsided gradually. She lifted a tear-wet face to press it against her son's cheek, and in her heart was a surge of thanksgiving that he was yet not old enough to go out into the world of men to fight his battles and frighten another woman as Pat so often frightened her. End of chapter 1.